Hi there. We're looking at chapter 13 in F.F. Bruce's book, The Real Jesus. Over here, it's published as Jesus, Lord and Savior. Chapter 13 has to do with Jesus and the Jewish parties of his day. And of course, he starts with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Of all the religious parties in Israel in the days of Jesus, the one with which he had least in common was the Sadducean party. The Sadducees appear to have been drawn from the wealthy landed aristocracy, the old established families. It was they who supported the Hasmonean dynasty of priest-kings during most of the time that it exercised power. It was from their ranks that in the period following the collapse of the Hasmonean dynasty, the high priests and members of the temple establishment came. They belonged to a different social class from the rank and file of ordinary priests, who were of humble status, living by their work on the land when their presence was not required in the temple. The number of priests was so large that, apart from the great festivals, a priest would serve in the temple for 1 week only in each half year. Theologically, the Sadducees followed what they believed to be the old-time religion. They regarded the Pharisees as innovators, with their oral tradition designed to adapt the ancient law to modern conditions. The Pharisees' belief in the resurrection of the body was rejected by the Sadducees as a new doctrine with no biblical foundation. The one Old Testament document where it is unambiguously taught is the book of Daniel, but the Sadducees quite probably did not accept that book as part of the canon of sacred writings. The one occasion on which Jesus is recorded as having encountered the Sadducees on the theological level was when some of them approached him in the temple court during his last week in Jerusalem and presented to him the conundrum about the resurrection which we have mentioned above. Jesus took care to reply to them on the basis of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, to which they accorded the highest authority. Some scribes of the Pharisaic party who were listening in were so impressed by his reply that they could not withhold their commendation. "Well spoken, teacher," they said. Now, we need to insert here that many theological authors believe that the Sadducees denigrated the Old Testament books, with the exception, I shouldn't say denigrated, let's just say they put them on a lower level. Did they accept the prophets at all? Well, as he suggests here, they probably rejected Daniel and maybe many of the other prophets in the Old Testament. At the very least, they put the Torah at a much higher level than the rest of the Old Testament. Now he talks of the Pharisees. The reader of the Gospels is sometimes surprised to be told that the party with which Jesus had most in common was the Pharisees. How comes it then, he may ask, that Jesus and the Pharisees appear to have been involved in controversy every time they crossed each other's path? A partial answer to that question is found in the fact of experience that, in religion as in politics, it is often those parties that have most in common that engage most in mutual criticism. Our perspective will be enlarged if we take account of the evidence of the Acts of the Apostles in addition to that of the Gospels. The disciples of Jesus, who formed the Church of Jerusalem shortly after his death and resurrection, met with opposition chiefly from the Sadducees. This is intelligible when we recall that it was the Sadducean chief priests who handed Jesus over to Pilate. They could not be expected to look any more kindly on Jesus' followers. But theologically, the Sadducees took sharp exception to the disciples' public preaching because they had proclaimed that Jesus had been raised from the dead in anticipation of the end-time resurrection, in which the Sadducees did not believe. But partly for that very reason, the disciples were tolerated, if not encouraged, by the Pharisees. Gamaliel, for example, the most influential Pharisee of his day, and the leader of the Pharisaic group in the Sanhedrin, spoke up in the Sanhedrin when the chief priests were minded to take extreme action against the disciples. "Leave these men alone," he said. "If their movement is of purely human origin, it will fizzle out and come to nothing. But if it comes from God, you'll never be able to overthrow it. You might even be found fighting against God." That's Acts 5:34-39. Gamaliel expressed sound Pharisaic doctrine. The cause of God will win in the end, whatever human beings may do. On this occasion, Gamaliel's argument persuaded the majority of his fellow members of the Sanhedrin. There was indeed one young Pharisee, a pupil of Gamaliel's, who did not agree with his master in this matter. In his eyes, the new movement presented too deadly a threat to Israel's sacred traditions to be left in peace. It must be suppressed, and the sooner the better. But Saul of Tarsus, persecutor-in-chief of the infant church until his confrontation with the risen Lord on the Damascus road turned him into the leading propagator of the gospel, Saul of Tarsus was far from being a typical Pharisee. Some members of the Pharisaic party actually joined the early church in Jerusalem. To their existing beliefs, they added the belief that Jesus, crucified and now risen from the dead, was the promised Messiah of Israel. Their new faith did not oblige them to abandon any essential feature of their Pharisaism. They were foremost among those members of the Jerusalem church who tried to insist that Gentile converts to the new faith should be required to submit to various requirements of the law of Moses. This was probably their means of ensuring that such converts should be weaned from their former pagan ways by having to conform to a firm ethical code. It is interesting that the chief opponent of their policy should be no other than Saul, also called Paul, as he had in earlier days been a zealot for his ancestral traditions. So after his conversion, he showed himself a zealot in the cause of Christian liberty. It was of great importance in his eyes that Gentile converts should lead lives worthy of the Lord, whose followers they now were. But submission to the law of Moses was not, as he saw it, the way to achieve that end. Paul had been an exceptional Pharisee before his conversion, and after it he was an exceptional Christian. But even Paul, in his Christian days, could find himself on the same side of the fence as the Pharisees. During his last visit to Jerusalem, he was charged with a serious offense against the sanctity of the temple and was brought before the Sanhedrin. He began his defense by claiming that the central issue in the controversy in which he was involved with the leaders of the Jewish people was the resurrection. It is with regard to the hope of resurrection for the dead that I am now on trial. That's Acts 23 verse 6. This was not disingenuous. Paul knew from his own experience that Jesus had risen from the dead, and the resurrection of Jesus confirmed the resurrection faith in which he had been brought up. Moreover, the resurrection of Jesus was absolutely crucial to the gospel he proclaimed. As he says in another place, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. That's 1 Corinthians 15 verse 14. But when he expressed himself in these terms before the Sanhedrin, he divided that body into two. The Sadducean majority, of course, rejected his claim out of hand, but the Pharisees argued that a man who was so sound on the resurrection could not be terribly far astray. As for his Damascus Road experience, what if a spirit or an angel had spoken to him? To the Sadducees, who had no place in their creed for spirits or angels, this was so much nonsense. In the next episode, Jesus and the Pharisees. Link I'll put in is to, was Paul apostate? Because when he went up to Jerusalem, even many evangelical Christians now believe that both Paul and James compromised the Christian faith and Christian liberty.